So welcome to another slide. I'm going to talk about something very important here, which is critical thinking. Okay, so critical thinking is a term that's come up a lot in modern society, as we saw from the introduction to this video. It's fraught with a lot of misinformation, a lot of misuse of the term, and I think people are a little bit brain broken when it comes to thinking about critical thinking, because for the most part, when the supervisor sends a student a scathing report of their thesis, and the word critical thinking, critical engagement, or critical evaluation is mentioned in the feedback, their default is to sort of say to themselves, well, critical thinking, okay, they must mean that I just have to do X, Y, and Z. But usually X, Y, and Z have nothing to do with the thesis or nothing to do with critical thinking. Critical thinking, I'm going to give a little broad overview of what critical thinking is with some examples and how it's going to help you with your thesis, because I do think it's very important in this day and age to know the limits and the boundaries of critical thinking, so as not to stray too far from what your supervisor and by extension the college wants. So critical thinking is crucial when conducting a literature review for a thesis. So most often times you'll see the word critical thinking in relation to chapter 2, which is your literature review. And very basically, it involves systematically analyzing and evaluating the existing literature to identify gaps, strengths, weaknesses, and connections relevant to your research topic. So I have a little few strategies here for applying critical thinking in a literature review. So just keep these in mind whenever you're doing your literature review. Okay, so here's number 1. Identify themes and patterns. So most people, if they're doing qualitative or mixed methods, are familiar with the concept of thematic analysis, Braun and Clark, or IPA, or whatever type of analysis, so whatever type of thematic analysis you're doing. But rarely do people apply that same methodology to the literature review. Identify themes and patterns. So compare and contrast various studies to identify inconsistencies, contradictions, or gaps in the existing research. Consider how different methodologies or sample sizes may impact the results, okay? Look for recurring themes or patterns across different studies. This can involve common methodologies, theoretical frameworks, or findings. For example, if you're reviewing literature on the effects of social media on mental health, you might notice a recurring theme of increased anxiety and depression among heavy social media users across multiple studies. So what that is basically saying is the same stuff is going to crop up over and over again. You're going to see certain terms, certain findings are going to be universal across these studies. And all you're doing when you identify those themes is to say, okay, in the 10 studies I looked at, all 10 of them mentioned the inability to switch off from social media. So that's a theme you can use. And when you note that theme in your literature review, you're basically saying to yourself that, okay, I'm going to create my questionnaire, I'm going to do my interview questions. So if a theme of inability to switch off is coming up in the literature, well then it makes sense for me then to ask that question in interview. And the result of that is that when you do your discussion chapter and you're talking about all the data you've gathered about the inability to switch off, well now you have to compare it to previous literature. But because you're forward thinking, you have something to compare it to. You can say, well, I have 10 other studies here that mention the inability to switch off. So you're baking in a ready-made solution for yourself before you even get to the discussion chapter. So number 2, evaluate the methodologies, okay? Assess the methodologies used in each study. Consider factors such as sample size, research design, data collection methods, and statistical analysis. For instance, in a literature review on the effectiveness of CBT for treating anxiety disorders, you might critically evaluate the strengths and limitations of various research methodologies used in different studies, such as randomized controlled trials, longitudinal studies, or qualitative interviews. Don't be too disheartened by this words, critically evaluate. Critically evaluate means you're not just reading it, you're basically saying, okay, here's 5 studies, here's the strengths and weaknesses of these 5 studies. So you're basically just doing a bit more due diligence in it. You're not just regurgitating or vomiting the info back to me, okay? So don't be put off too much by these terms, critically evaluate. As we go through these slides and videos, you'll basically see that I'll start using them interchangeably because in many ways they can be used interchangeably. There are fancy ways of saying put more work in. Don't just vomit the information back at me, because we can all read a book. I'm looking for your interpretation, not so much your interpretation, sorry. I'm looking for now I'm going to use the term critical analysis of it, which basically means what I have here. I don't want blow by blow summary of what the book's about. I want the strengths, the limitations, what they use for their methodology, and what the limitations are. This is the good thing about using other people's theses, is that you'll see that people already include limitations. So when you're trying to evaluate a few different types of thesis, you have the abstract and the limitation section, which will make up the bulk of this information you need to gather. Number 3, assess the credibility of the source. And this is very important, especially in this day and age, is you need to evaluate the credibility and reliability of the sources you're citing. So consider factors such as the reputation of the authors, the publication venue, and whether the research has been peer reviewed. That's a fancy way of saying do not take all your information from Facebook or YouTube videos or spurious websites. Peer reviewed is the key concept here we're looking at here, okay? If you're using multiple studies and none of them are peer reviewed and none of them I've never heard of before, you're gonna invite disaster. That's not critically thinking. What you're doing there is you're being a contrarian. You're basically saying these 90% of studies that are out there, I'm going to discard them and I'm going to go off and find in the deep, dark recess of the internet sources that are not credible. So here's an example. For example, in a literature review on climate change impacts, you might prioritize peer-reviewed articles published in reputable journals over non-peer-reviewed sources. There's plenty of videos out there on how climate change is a scam, or how it's pushed by, whatever, choose your conspiracy theory. In university, you're not going to be looked upon as some sort of hero if you decide I'm going to go against the grain. And I think a lot of people do it accidentally when it says you need an original contribution to research, you need to stamp your own name on it. Do not stamp your own name on it by basically going against the majority of academia on the topic, okay? Be aware of potential bias in the literature. Evaluate the assumptions underlying different studies and consider how these assumptions might influence the interpretation of results. People sometimes get hung up on this one, okay? How do I know who's telling the truth or not? That's not what you're being evaluated on, and that's not what your thesis is going to be about. Your thesis is going to be gathering literature that is relevant to your study and that is peer reviewed. I keep banging on about it, but go check other people's thesis. Look at their bibliography. Look at the same books they're using over and over again. You can do no wrong by just using the same books. If you're ever stuck for, well, what books do I read? Just look at someone's thesis, because that thesis has got through and the college has deemed that bibliography to be relevant and peer-reviewed and important. So if you use that same bibliography, well, then you're sorted. Then you don't have to worry about who's lying and who's not. If you decide to stray off the path and go and gather your own research, you're gonna encounter trouble. Here we go. Number 4, identify and synthesize. Now, what does that mean? Identify gaps in the literature. Look for gaps or unresolved questions in the existing literature. Consider areas where future research is needed or where contradictory findings exist. For instance, in a literature review on renewable energy adoption, you might identify a gap in the research on the socio-economic factors influencing adoption rates in developing countries. Another thing you'll find is a study might look at this. Let's say you may have found research that does this, but maybe they haven't looked at it from in a certain country, or they haven't looked at this particular point in relation to another variable. So there's always ways and angles you can come in on stuff. So synthesize information from multiple sources to develop a coherent narrative. Compare and contrast different studies, theories, or perspectives to identify overarching trends or theoretical frameworks. For example, in a literature review on organizational culture and employee performance, you might synthesize findings from multiple studies to develop a nuanced understanding of how different aspects of organizational culture impacts various dimensions of employee performance. It's a bit of a mouthful there, okay? You're basically saying, well, what's the lay of the land? What's the actual what's the issue? Okay, so you may need to look at multiple studies there to get a broad overview of the picture. Number 5, evaluate sources. Okay, so this is another way We've touched upon it there, is know the credibility of our sources, but how do we do that in a more specific way? Okay, so critically analyze the findings presented in each study, consider the strengths and weaknesses of the evidence provided, and any potential biases or limitations. So we've already looked at stuff like that. So for instance, in a literature review on the efficacy of mindfulness-based interventions for stress reduction, you might critically analyze the study designs and measurement tools used to assess outcomes, as well as potential confounding variables that could impact the results. Now, one that comes to mind there is someone interviewing participants in an organization where the interviewer also works in the organization. So did people in that interview or even focus group feel that they had to reply or give answers in a particular way that pleased the interviewer? So were they being truthful there in that case? Follow the citations in the literature to trace the development of ideas over time. So this is sort of what I was saying about checking people's bibliographies. Identify key influential studies and assess how they have shaped the current state of knowledge. So the lovely named CRAP test. Okay, so you've probably seen this a few times if you're doing a systematic review. So it's a set of criteria used to evaluate the quality and reliability of information sources, particularly in academic or research settings. The test covers 5 key criteria: currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. Okay. Another thing is the ABC checklist. A is for author. Is the author clearly identified? What is the author's level of expertise on the subject? B for bias. Is the purpose of the information to inform or to persuade? It's very important. This is going to distinguish your classic academic text from your modern YouTube videos. What is the agenda behind it? Okay. Do not bring the YouTube talking point generational stuff into the academic stuff. Most academic texts do not have agendas in the same way that YouTube videos that are researched have agendas. Okay. Is the information fact or opinion? If it's opinion, is it backed up with evidence? Okay, so that's the important thing between research and opinion. Anecdotal evidence versus empirical evidence. We all have opinions on stuff, but can you back it up? So is the language emotive or neutral? This is a very important thing. That's why your supervisor and lecturers always go on about do not have a casual tone in your thesis, because whether you intend to or not, it looks like you pulled most of the information out of your arse. Try and keep everything neutral. Neutral tone, neutral language. Academic writing is very simple, very plain, very neutral. When you start going into, using the first person saying, well, I think this and that sort of stuff, you do yourself no favors. C is for currency. So when was the information published? So check the copyright date in the book's imprint page, okay? The date of issue for magazines, journals, and newspapers, or for a website when it was last updated, okay? So there's no point pulling information from a website that is out of date, or pulling information from a website that has a particular agenda. I'm not going to repeat too much what I said in my research question tips and tricks video, but essentially, whenever you're trying to figure out what exactly is critical thinking, look at the undergrad, masters, and PhD theses that have all got through. You can guarantee 100% that every single one of those theses has utilized critical thinking in the correct manner. Just grab another thesis. If your supervisor is saying your literature review needs more critical analysis, and you're like, I have no idea what that means. I thought I knew what it meant, but apparently I don't, because I keep getting chapter 2 flung back at me. Grab a thesis out of the library. Look at their chapter 2. What are they doing differently? And write it down on a piece of paper. How is their chapter 2 different from my chapter 2? And look for important stuff like critical thinking. In lieu of this slideshow, okay? Is everything backed up? Are they using the same sources over and over again? Which is proper. It's good. There's a reason it's been used for 20, 30 years, because it has something important to say that has not been really challenged, or it may be expanded upon. But it hasn't been refuted, and that's the important part. There's no point putting in sources that are spurious, or they're Wikipedia pages that with links that go nowhere, or links that go to dead pages. So whenever you're looking at someone else's thesis, just look at what they've done differently. An important part will be the academic language, and I will get to that in another video. But for now, I would say there's enough in this slideshow to make sure that when the word critical thinking or critical engagement or critical evaluation or critical analysis comes up, this is what they're mainly talking about.